Profiles in Cinemania, a brief history of Headsplosions.
A warning to the listener, this profile in Cinemania may cause you to lose your mind.
Of all the gory effects, there's one that is guaranteed to provoke a reaction from the audience. Exploding a character's head. I mean, decapitation is pretty gnarly on its own, but complete cranial demolition? That represents a sort of erasure that frankly squicks folks out. The Cinemania Society's legal department has insisted I provide this mea culpa. I originally set out to write a more scholarly history on exploding heads on screen, but it's surprisingly slippery. Yes, I'm intending that pun. I'm not a coward. I searched the internet pretty thoroughly. I looked for books on the topic, and wouldn't you know it, I couldn't really find a lot. Hell, I even tried reaching out to some of the most prestigious effects artists in the industry, the guys responsible for perpetrating some of the most iconic headsplosions in cinema, namely Chris Walas and Tom Savini. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, they never got back to me. I mean, shit, these guys have been in the business damn near 50 years and they're still in high demand, so it's no wonder they didn't have time. I've had to draw a lot of what you're about to hear from a mixture of my personal industry experiences, film history studies, educated guesses, vague hunches, and even a couple of rectally sourced facts. I'll let you guess which is which. By the way, Chris, if you're listening to this, no hard feelings, my dude. I'll still buy you a beer next time I'm up in your neck of the woods. So, with that enormous caveat, in this profile I will present my personal hypotheses about exploding heads in cinema, where they came from, where they're going, and how they went from a film fetish to something de rigueur in much the same way that stripper heels basically became standard fashion. I mean, seriously though, you used to have to buy those things mail order from the back of a magazine you could go to jail for possessing to something you could just find on the shelf of a Kohl's, you know? As long as we're going to turn back time, let me take you all back to the year 1967, the year Wikipedia records as that in which the Hays Code officially died. If you are unfamiliar with the Hays Code, go back and have a listen to our profile in Cinemania on William H. Hays. Okay, I'm guessing you can't be arsed to do this, so let me summarize. It was basically a list crafted by religious moralists of all the things they feared would tip society into decay and decline. Stuff filmmakers weren't allowed to show on screen or discuss in a film if they wanted to get that film distributed in the United States, which was the largest film market at the time, and actually one of the largest still today. But because it was enforced by a private industry association and not a government body, it wasn't technically censorship, even if it did exactly that. Among the things the code banned were the depiction of drinking, gambling, lustful kissing, exposed bosoms, shareable beds, Thompson guns, narcotics, and, I am not making this up, pointing guns at people. You'd better believe that graphic violence was right out. From 1929 to 1967, filmmakers, with a few notable exceptions, had to make do with implied violence, pantomime deaths, and maybe, if you were lucky, the occasional squib. Honestly, you got more graphic violence than Looney Tunes. When the Hays Code was introduced, talkies had only been around a mere 18 months, seeing as the 45 years or so before that were mostly experiments establishing cinema as a technology, industry, and art form. The code loomed over cinema of the mid-20th century like a vicar with a stiffy. In real life, Pop might have gotten to shank a Jerry with a bayonet or have witnessed the horrors of the death camps, but could he watch people make out on screen? Genuss verboten. But, you cry, what about all those cowboy movies and WW2 flicks with John Wayne? There were loads of guns in those. Sure, but go back and actually look at them. There's lots of stuff going bang, lots of crosscuts to people keeling over. It's all right on the edge. And as any BDSM aficionado could tell you, you can only edge someone for so long. Now imagine a whole society that's been edged for a couple of generations, and, well, you'll start to get the idea of where this is going. By the time the late 60s rolled around, the Hays Code had also been in place through 2 brutal industrialized wars and was seeing through a third. Americans had grown up hearing blood-curdling tales from family and peers around the dinner table, then witnessed the horrors of war brought home to their television sets. They had been living with the threat of imminent nuclear annihilation and had come to the realization that neither government nor big business usually did things in the best interest of the population. A certain nihilism had taken hold in society, and who could blame them? People wanted arts and entertainment reflective of real life, not some cartoonish abstraction. It was nihilism that finally broke the last bonds of the Hays Code and caused it to be replaced with the film rating system we all know today. That collapse represented the industry's final, grudging acknowledgement that not every single movie churned out by the studios is meant for every single viewer, which incidentally set the stage for today's hyper-fragmentation of the media market. To be fair, the boomers had already been exploring adult content through blue movies imported from France and Sweden. Yeah, you know the ones I mean. But the rating system meant that the industry could officially explore making movies aimed at adults. The dam burst in 1968 with George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, the original zombie movie. The film contained a scene in which a group of ghouls ate a person's intestines. The next year, Sam Peckinpah blew away audiences and Mexican soldiers with his landmark Western movie The Wild Bunch, which contained loads of previously forbidden graphic violence. Another landmark film of the era took things even further, 1973's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. None of these films contain exploding heads, but they were nothing like anything the previous decades of filmmaking had ever seen. And they made money.
Oh, come on, Cinquisitor Ethan. When are we getting to the exploding heads?
What was that I said about edging?
We didn't like it then, and we don't like it now.
What, you mean edging or my reference to it?
What? Ew. No, neither, you creep.
Okay, fine, but don't expect anything like a complete list. I'm just going to cover the highlights.
Aw, tease.
As best as I can tell, the first exploding head appeared on screen in Death Race 2000. This film was produced by, who else, Roger Corman, king of exploitation cinema, and it hit screens in 1975, a mere 3 days before the fall of Saigon. Death Race is a biting dystopian satire that simultaneously celebrates and pokes fun at the American appetite for violence in game shows, while providing some thinly veiled commentary on Nixon-era abuses of executive power. There's a lot of violence in this film, both graphic and implied, and it combines cartoonish sound effects with its brutal visuals, which is a choice. The headsplosion in question occurs when Stallone's car, yes, that Stallone, drives over and thereby crushes someone's head. This effect is pretty tame by today's standards. It basically looks like someone running over a rubber Halloween mask filled with styrofoam and blood, but hey, an exploding head is still an exploding head, am I right? The next notable head explosion to which I want to call your attention is one that appeared 3 years later, in 1978's Dawn of the Dead, the sequel to Night of the Living Dead. From intestinal to cranial destruction, they're moving up in the world. It appears in the opening montage. Society is collapsing, so a bunch of racist cops decide to, surprise, surprise, blame things on black people. They storm a ghetto apartment block and detonate an innocent resident's cranium with a shotgun blast. Blink and you'll miss it. Brief though it was a true head explosion. In those few frames we see the complete evaporation of everything above the neck into a fine red mist. This effect was pulled off by the legendary Tom Savini using a dummy head molded from his own. What would Freud say about that? Savini was himself a Vietnam War veteran, and I am perfectly willing to speculate that his departure into special gore effects had been a means of processing his war trauma. In fact, I'm willing to go so far as to say that the fixation with violence, gore, and in particular headsplosions were a way of processing war trauma for most of America. Make a note of that because that point's coming back later. Filmmakers throughout the 70s really seemed to be competing over who could shock and titillate audiences more. Every trip turns bad at some point, and for boomer-era cinema, that was the 70s. It's called the come-down era for a reason. Incidentally, Dawn of the Dead was also the film that kicked off the whole you gotta shoot him in the head trope as the method of dealing with zombies. As the 70s turned into the 80s, exploding heads began to become a regular feature of grindhouse cinema. In 1980's Maniac, Savini was at it again with a shotgun headsplosion, only this time in close-up and in slow motion. 1981 brought head explosions from cult cinema into the mainstream. Most notably, David Cronenberg's film Scanners contained one of the most graphic and remarkable headsplosions ever shown on film, when Daryl Revick, played by the incomparable Michael Ironside, psychically detonates the head of the Frank Oz lookalike sitting right next to him. Even if you haven't watched Scanners, you've probably seen this headsplosion. If you put exploding head into a GIF search, this is the one that comes up. The effect was achieved by another legend of gore effects, Chris Walas, who pulled it off via a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun under the chin of a wax head filled with fake blood and leftover cheeseburgers. Incidentally, Chris Walas is still just about the only effects guy working who has a tax stamp that permits him to possess a sawed-off. Later that same year, a trifecta of graphic head traumas appeared in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg wasn't about to be outdone by anyone, so Raiders featured Nazis and their collaborators suffering an exploding head, an imploding head, and a melting head, all courtesy of the power of God, TM. Though God subcontracted to Industrial Light and Magic, and ILM got Chris Walas. Outland, also from 1981, in addition to being a Sean Connery vehicle with absolutely stunning special effects that hold up to this day, featured a space miner who suffers a suit malfunction and experiences sudden decompression that causes his head to explode. The Aussies weren't about to be left in the dust either. After all, they fielded troops in Vietnam too. The Road Warrior, aka Mad Max 2, had a shotgun head detonation in the big chase scene at the end. 1984's Return of the Living Dead, an homage to, but no affiliation with, George A. Romero's franchise, had some pretty spectacular cranial trauma, but distinguished itself with brain-eating zombies who were immune to the effects of decapitation. The 80s wore on, and exploding heads continued their migration from grindhouse to more legitimate, which is to say mainstream, cinema. 1986 was a watermark year for graphic decapitations of all sorts. I'm going to start with Stuart Gordon's criminally weird flick, From Beyond.
You say that like it's a crime.
Yes, I believe that is exactly what I'm saying. How else could you describe a movie featuring Jeffrey Combs thirsting for brains with a creepy dog dork sticking out of his forehead?
Technically perfect.
Whatever. Anyhow, Lovecraftian beasties from beyond the veil slurp whole heads straight off necks. There was Wes Craven's Deadly Friend, where Christy Swanson, better known as the cinematic version of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, throws a basketball at Anne Ramsey, better known as Mama Fratelli from the Goonies, and somehow causes her head to explode. Ted Nicolau's Terror Vision copies Outland with a scene involving a space alien trying to recover a wandering mutant pet, but then suffers a critical pressure suit malfunction that causes his head to explode and paint his helmet's faceplate in purple goo. Chopping Mall features a bunch of mall security robots accidentally set on Destroy All Humans mode, and, of course, one explodes a teenager's head with a laser. And finally, The Fly, where Chris Walas teamed back up with David Cronenberg to bring moviegoers one of the grossest remakes of all time. At the end of the movie, Gina Davis uses a shotgun in a mercy killing, blowing the head off Jeff Goldblum / Brundlefly. 1987 had some great head explosions in big and small budget films, and for the first time head explosions were being done tongue in decapitated cheek. Most notably, this happened in the debut film of Peter Jackson. Yes, that Peter Jackson, Bad Taste, where a group of alien fast food execs descend upon Earth to sell human meat as fast food. Two iconic mega-budget sci-fi blockbusters of '87 also featured cranial eversions, RoboCop and Predator. Weirdly, 1989's pregno-comedy Look Who's Talking, starring Kirstie Alley and Bruce Willis's voice, featured a first-of-its-kind family-friendly head explosion. Alley's character is fantasizing about her baby daddy's head exploding, but this is purely puff of smoke and sparks territory, nothing graphic. The 1990s saw Hong Kong action cinema getting in on the act. Ricky-O, the story of Ricky, contained some of the most graphically violent footage ever produced for the big screen, let alone by that market, including a scene where a guy tries to strangle a sparring opponent to death with his own intestines. Not the stranglee's guts, the strangler's own guts. And yes, you'd better believe this picture has headsplosions galore. By this point, an exploding head was becoming pretty much a standard of R-rated films. Peter Jackson built on his prior reputation of using head explosions as a joke. His 1990 film Braindead, aka Dead Alive, featured a lot of comically graphic gore effects. Besides some obligatory exploding heads, the film also features a scene where the protagonist is chased up a chandelier by a reanimated set of intestines that farts while trying to strangle him.
Yeah, don't forget several technical explosions via weaponized lawnmower, no less. And one... Maybe no one puts baby in a corner, but Peter Jackson sure put baby in a blender.
Ugh, true. Jackson's next film, 1996's The Frighteners, features a gag where Jeffrey Combs' character has his head blown off, only to have it instantly replaced by the ghostly version of his head. Note that this is the first instance I can find of a film with a graphic headsplosion getting a PG-13 rating. Look Who's Talking doesn't count, it wasn't graphic. But The Frighteners wasn't to be the last. Tim Burton's 1999 film Mars Attacks, also rated PG-13, concludes with a bevy of CGI Martian heads exploding. By the 2000s, this effect had lost so much of its punch that it even started appearing on basic cable television. The Comedy Central series Chappelle's Show had a bit in which a white supremacist who, upon learning the author of his favorite bigoted screeds was a blind black man who didn't know he was black, suffers a spontaneous head explosion, thereby cementing the entry of the term exploding heads into socio-political discourse. And sure, there are plenty other movies, not to mention premium cable series I haven't mentioned, most of them zombie apocalypse themed in one way or another, all of which feature exploding heads galore. But at this point, you get the idea. No point in exploding a dead horse. So there you have it. Headsplosions emerged as blowback. Oh, grow up. Blowback from 40 years of self-imposed censorship under the Hays Code, combined with Americans processing trauma through 3 horrific wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, first portraying exploding heads as tragedy, then through subsequent repetitions as farce. The emergence of graphic violence in cinema, particularly exploding heads, created a taste for gory effects in Generation X and early millennials, and then by virtue of their prevalence, exploding heads simply became part of the scenery for Gen Z.
As Brother Andy always says, it's a simple story, really. Repression, expression, repetition, acclamation, integration.
Sure, fine, whatever. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. This has been another Profile in Cinemania. This episode was written and performed by Ethan Ireland and Daniel Scribner. Music by Meteor at meteormusic.bandcamp.com. Incidental music courtesy of Epidemic Sound. Profiles in Cinemania is a product of the Cinemania Society, LLC.